Chapter 3. Saturday, late afternoon. By the time Scott left, Doreen's head was really pounding, partly from the earlier attack but also with the good news from Scott. Her mind was completely awestruck. Scott would come back later with more answers about his notes. He'd gone away to do some research but had called dibs on several sets of furniture. He was curious about a couple odd chairs. In his words, he'd said, "At this point, I respect your grandmother's acuity in regard to antiques, so I have no idea why she has a few of these pieces here." "Well, I could ask her," she said. Scott looked at her and said, "I know it's an imposition, my dear, but is there any chance I could talk to her?" Doreen's eyebrows shot up. "I don't see why not," she said. "I'd have to call her, of course, and make sure it's convenient." "Absolutely," he said. "I've taken as many photographs as I want of everything here. And obviously the Packers will come back and take that dresser." He looked at it and smiled. "I can't believe you've got a complete set now." He shook his head. "It just boggles the mind." "And I still have to empty those drawers too," she said. "Then, of course, as soon as I can, we'll get the items out of the dining room." "What about the hutches?" she asked, pointing to the back. He nodded. "They're on my list to do some further research. Maybe call your grandmother, see if you can set up a time to have a cup of tea or something, so I can talk to her. And I'll bring my tablet. We can ask her about some of the pieces in question." "Sure," she said, "I can ask her right now if you like." Of course, Nan hadn't been available. Scott had finally taken his leave as he said, "I've got work to do. I'm still in town tonight. If she's readily available early evening or tomorrow morning, that all works for me." As soon as he was gone, petting each of the animals as he passed through the kitchen, she dialed Nan again. And true to form, Nan answered this time. "Where were you?" Doreen asked in frustration. "The antiques appraiser wanted to come and visit with you." "Oh, that would be lovely," Nan said. "How are you doing with the rest of that furniture in the house?" "The couch and matching chairs, even several coffee tables, he said he'd be happy to take. I think 3 dining room sets as well, and of course the tall boy we found. But there are a lot of odd pieces, Nan, and I guess he's curious as to why you have those." "Well, some were missing pieces from sets I heard about in the antiquity underworld," she said. "And then I brought them home, thinking I had a piece of history connected to something nobody else had because I had the odd piece." "Ah." Doreen shook her head. "But then why didn't you sell them?" "I couldn't be bothered," Nan said cheerfully. "I think there are about 6 pieces that belong to incomplete sets because I have the final piece." Doreen stared at her phone. "Okay," she said, "if we brought you the photos, could you tell us which ones?" "Probably," Nan said. "Did you find the paperwork yet?" "No," Doreen said, looking around her living room. "I thought for sure once we got rid of the main living room furniture, I'd find it." "It's definitely in the house. Make sure they don't take anything without you having checked it over," she warned Doreen. Doreen nodded. "I already found a set of pearls and emeralds." "Nan, they're beautiful." "Oh my, pearls and emeralds. I don't think I remember those." "They appear to be great-great-grandmother's," Doreen said. "They were in the hidden drawers in the tall boy. It had 2 secret drawers again, but they were long skinny drawers and full of jewelry. Absolutely stunning pieces. And they'll probably fetch a pretty price too," Nan said. Doreen nodded, but she wasn't sure she wanted to sell them. "I still have to empty the drawers in the tall boy. What time can Scott come to meet with you?" "He's gone back to his hotel to do some research on some of the pieces you've got here." "Good," Nan said briskly. "Because every piece I bought for a reason." "I'm hoping you'll remember the reason why," Doreen said dryly. "We have an awful lot of furniture here that he's not too interested in." "Hogwash," she said. "He should be interested in every one of those pieces." I expect Scott to have his truck full, taking everything away. Then you can start fresh. That would be nice, Doreen said, but I don't think I'll have that option. Yes, you will. Just bring him here to talk to me. And in the meantime, find those papers. When do you want Scott there? He said later today or tomorrow morning works for him. No time like the present, she said. Bring him by at 6 o'clock if that's okay. If not, how about 7? Doreen nodded. I'll check in with Scott and see which one of those times works for him. You do that, Nan said. And in the meantime, find that paperwork. That'll help jog my memory. And she hung up. Doreen groaned. Just because Nan said Doreen should find the paperwork didn't mean it was that easy, but first she had to check the tallboy drawers. With the jewels still in her pocket, she went back downstairs into the basement and carefully opened each and every drawer, and found they were all full. She walked back up to the kitchen looking for an empty box, but of course there wasn't anything. Snagging a couple large plastic hampers, she carried them downstairs and emptied the drawers into the hampers. She unearthed everything from scarves to blankets to some small boxes. Arranging the contents side by side, she carried both hampers back upstairs and wished she had better light and an opportunity to sit down there and look at the items more carefully. She carried them right into the kitchen, where she set them on the table. Just as she was about to go through them, Scott called her back. She gave him the options to meet Nan. How about 6 o'clock this afternoon, he asked. I found out some interesting bits and pieces, and forgot to tell you about the china set you've got there too. I'll come by, pick you up, and we can go to Nan's place together. Perfect, Doreen said. I just emptied the tallboy. I'm still looking for the provenance paperwork. Nan wanted to see it too, because she thought it would help jog her memory. Any idea where it is? He asked anxiously. No, Doreen said, gently brushing her hair off her face, careful to not disturb her new stitches, while looking around the kitchen. I've gotten rid of a lot of stuff, yet there's still so much here to go through. My grandmother was the same, Scott said. If she could find a bargain, she bought it whether she needed it or not, he said with a chuckle. At least in your case, your grandmother seems to have had a knack for pricey antiques. Sure, I just don't know where I'm supposed to find her proof of all of it. Keep looking, he said. I'll be there in about 45 minutes. Knowing she didn't have time to go through all the items she'd pulled from the tallboy, she checked for an envelope of receipts or a folder of paperwork of any kind. But nothing like that was in the hampers. She headed back downstairs, knowing the hutches had drawers as well. She didn't know if they had any secret drawers, mind you, but those weren't likely if they weren't part of the same set. She started at the top right and went through the drawers one by one, and groaned at every one because silver and china were inside but no paperwork. By the time she'd gotten through everything with drawers she found in the basement, she got more and more frazzled. She looked around but there was no cupboard, so she could see nothing else downstairs that would hide away Nan's paperwork. She'd forgotten to show Scott this stuff in this side room, the cold room as Mac had called it, and he probably needed to see this stuff too because who knew if any of it had any value. She took a couple more pictures of the big butter churn and a humongous mixer, but it was a floor model, like used in a commercial bakery, maybe? She wasn't sure. Still, no paperwork was located. If it had been her, Doreen wouldn't have kept it very far away. It should have been upstairs in the office. But Nan had no office in this house. Doreen stopped, thought about that, and realized the kitchen served as Nan's office. She headed back upstairs, her gaze going around the dining room, finding no paperwork there. She went around the living room, nothing there. She checked the front closet, found nothing there, and headed into the kitchen. The downstairs wasn't very big, so unless the provenance folder was upstairs in her bedroom, it had to be in the kitchen. Her gaze landed on the huge pantry full of shelves and more shelves. While some were built in, it seemed Nan had added a couple cherry standalone shelving units on the short wall. While some canned goods and pet food were in here, most of the shelves held paper goods, whether loose pages or bound books like cookbooks. She'd been in and out of that pantry lots of times because she stored some of Thaddeus's and also Goliath's food there. She pulled open the door and frowned at the shelves stacked full of stuff, and definitely lots of papers were on most of them. Clearing off the kitchen table, she put her hampers off to one side, knowing their contents could very well be as valuable as anything they'd found so far. She removed all the paperwork from the pantry. She didn't have much time before Scott returned. She had one shelf emptied when she came upon several brown envelopes. One was income taxes from God only knew what year. As she peeked inside, she could see several years' worth. She checked the others, and one more was income taxes as well, but they were from 20 years ago. She shook her head, placed them off to one side, and looked at the third envelope. It opened on the side with a twine thread that wrapped around a button to tie it shut. She opened it and gently removed the papers inside. She pulled up a chair to take a quick look and cried, "Eureka!" It appeared to be full of paperwork and receipts and bills of sale. Knowing she was out of time, she closed it up again, grabbed her shoes and a sweater, fed the animals so they wouldn't go hungry while waiting for her to come home, giving them each a hug and a kiss, then secured her home, and stepped onto the front porch just as Scott drove up. She met him in the driveway, and as she got into his rental car, he looked at the big envelope folder that she carried and asked, "Is that it?" "I'm not exactly sure," she said. "I haven't had a chance to take a closer look. I figured if I could show it to Nan, she might recognize it." "Good idea. Now where do I go?" he asked. She pointed out the directions, and within 6 minutes, they pulled into the parking lot of the retirement home. She led him through the front doors and around to Nan's apartment door. Doreen figured it would be unlocked, and it was, thankfully. She called out and led Scott through to the patio. Nan looked at her in surprise, then at the garden path, and said, "Oh, you didn't walk?" "No," Doreen said. "Sorry, no animals with me today. I'll bring them and the jewelry another time." She stepped to the side and said, "Nan, this is Scott Rawson from Christie's auction house." Nan rose and in a smooth motion held out her hand, almost as if he should kiss it. Scott stepped forward, leaned over her hand gently, and whispered, "Lovely to meet you." And damn if Nan didn't simper. Doreen just stared at her, seeing a side of her grandmother she rarely caught glimpses of. But it was amazing just how much her grandmother responded to the male attention, and yet shouldn't be so surprising, and how young and lovely she looked. "Scott is in awe of your antique finding ability," Doreen said. Nan just chuckled. "I don't know about that," she said. "I just had fun with it." "And it shows," he said. "Would you mind if I record our conversation to help me remember all the details about your pieces that we'll discuss tonight?" "Of course not. Please do." Nan nodded. A wave of her hand was added too. "A large group of us really enjoyed our antiques. We used to go hunting them. Always taking great pleasure when we found a piece the others had missed." "Did that happen often?" Doreen asked, confused. Scott shook his head. "I would imagine not often, but with big sets, pieces are often lost, and then sometimes a piece gets separated and nobody realizes its value, and they toss it." "In our case," Nan said, "we went to a couple big estates where sets had been sold and individual pieces had been missed. I believe one estate involved a family dispute where one of the sons got a smaller portion of the inheritance, so, in defiance, he took his portion out by taking a few pieces of every one of the antique sets of furniture in the house. Obviously, he didn't need the money, but he was more intent on making sure everybody else didn't get the maximum money either when selling the incomplete sets." "How did you get a hold of that then?" Scott asked curiously. "He was a friend of mine," she said. "He was getting rid of stuff once he found out he had cancer. So I bought the whole lot off of him." "So that's why you've got just a pair of chairs here and there?" She nodded. "Absolutely. And a couple of those other pieces are very expensive. Scott frowned, held up his tablet and asked, "These?" Nan looked at the photo. "Those aren't as valuable." She flicked through the pictures on Scott's tablet and then stabbed her finger on one of the photographs. "These two came from one of the big sets." She flicked over more pictures and then said, these two, and these two." Scott looked at the photos and chuckled. "Well, you're right about 4 of them," he said. "The other 2 pair aren't as valuable, but it's not about their antique status." "I don't think the son cared about value as long as he made sure he broke up the sets so nobody else could sell them for as much money," Nan said. "Families are interesting critters. Now the trick is whether anybody who has those pieces is looking for the missing pieces," Scott said. She nodded. "I figure an auction house like yours, once you put it out in the catalog of what's coming up for sale, should attract some attention." "You could be right there," he said, nodding. He pointed to one picture of the Hutches in her basement. "This is an interesting piece. Where did you get that?" She launched into a tale. "I'd been down at the local antique store where Fen was fed up with having no money, getting no sales, and living in a town full of people too penny pinching for what he needed to thrive, to even survive. He had rent to pay," she said, "so I bought it off of him cheap." "How cheap?" Nan thought about it for a moment and said, "I'm not exactly sure, but I think about $400. Of course it's worth about $17,000 now. You know that, right?" Nan laughed. "Poor Fen. He could use the $17,000 too." "I know that feeling," Doreen said, shaking her head. "So, Nan, is everything in the basement valuable?" "Most of it, yes," Nan said. "It's hard for me to say everything is because, at one point, I was struggling to find room to store stuff." She held out her hand for the tablet Scott had. "Would you mind?" He handed it over, and she slowly flicked through the pictures, coming up with an interesting story for several of them. Scott was recording this conversation, so he had something further to document the provenance of all Nan's finds. There was nothing quite like people's memories. When Nan ran through all the photos and pulled out 3 pieces she said were really just garbage, Scott nodded and said, "You do know your antiques." "I know some of them," she said. "Those hutches downstairs contain all that damn silverware because it was impossible to clean." "Silver?" Scott asked. He turned to look at Doreen. She nodded. "After you left, I took a look in the drawers and there is a lot of silverware," she said. "Everything from cream and sugar bowls and tureens to soup ladles and cutlery. Tons and tons of it." "I know," Nan said. "When my Nan was alive, it used to be fun to buff and polish silver together, but I very quickly learned that was a complete waste of energy. They just tarnish all over again." "I don't think I've ever done it," Doreen admitted. "You won't want to," Nan said. "If you can sell it, do please. I'll have to take a look at it, but pure silver of a decent age is valuable, particularly if you have some provenance attached to it." He looked at Doreen and motioned to the stack of papers in front of her. "I do. And the china too," Nan said. "Such delicate stuff. But I always felt like I was in danger of breaking it, so I could never really enjoy a cup of tea in it." "Exactly," Doreen said. "I have broken so many old cups already." "I did check," he said, "because I did take pictures of the china with me. I spoke to Randy, and he got very excited and said that set of china should come back with me and go in the auction. He did give me some details, but honestly, I don't remember. China is not my thing, as I said. But I do have it in an email from him that I'll send to you." "That would be good because lots of boxes of that are in my dining room now too." 3 sets, Nan said. "Should be 3 full sets." Doreen shook her head. "Then yes please. Sell it all. I'll just break them." "Unless you want to keep a set for your children," Scott said quietly. Doreen winced. "I don't think I'll be having any of my own," she said quietly. I'm afraid Nan's family line stops with me. Isn't that a shame? Nan said.